From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Georgette Dorn, and I'm the chief of the Hispanic Division. Is it not working? It is. And I want to thank the Hispanic Culture Society for co-sponsoring this program with us, with the Hispanic Division. All my colleagues in the Hispanic Division have been long-time fans of Ray Suarez. And I kept watching him every night for years and years, and then suddenly he was gone. So I said, I never even asked him to come and talk at the library. So one of his former colleagues from PBS was very helpful and gave me his email, so I emailed him and he accepted right away. So we're very pleased to have here Ray Suarez, who for many years was on the PBS NewsHour, and before that he worked in radio. He had many national programs, America Abroad from Public Radio International. He was the host of the national public radio program Talk of the Nation from 1993 to 1999. And in addition, he is the author of several books. His most recent one, Latinos, Latin Americans, the 500 Years Legacy That Shaped the Nation, which was published this year, and hopefully they'll be here for sale. And then also The Old Neighborhood, What We Lost in the Great Suburban Migration, 1966-1999, and The Holy Vote, The Politics of Faith in America. Ray Suarez.
Thank you, Georgette, and thanks for having me with you today. Usually when I'm asked to talk on the topic of how America's changing, I'm speaking to entirely or mostly Anglo audiences who bring some curiosity and maybe in the back of their mind no little bit of cultural anxiety to the event. What will the change underway mean for them, their kids, their grandkids? Sometimes it feels, especially in this last half year or so, like I've been saying to the country, welcome to the America that many of us already know. Welcome to my world. I've been lecturing recently about the new book that Georgette mentioned on the 500-year story of the creation of this part, our branch of the American family. So all this stuff is very much front brain, right on my mind, and how to talk to it to different audiences. I guess I can boil down the 250 pages or so of the book into a few simple propositions. One, we're not new. Our story is older than Plymouth Rock and Jamestown. Number two, a lot of us are here because the U.S. was there, invading Mexico, invading Cuba, seizing Puerto Rico, occupying Nicaragua, breaking Panama off of Colombia, and on and on and on. And three, once a group of people, any group of people, becomes a sixth of the whole, in this case more than 50 million out of 310 million, it's no longer a question of how those people over there are doing and whether or not they're making it. We are saying to the rest of America, we are you, you are us, our fates are intertwined, perhaps to a degree that makes you uncomfortable, but that doesn't change the fact that our fates are intertwined. That requires a change in the way all Americans think of this country, no longer as an English thing that ended up incorporating or absorbing other cultures, but as a continent-sized country that was multicultural from day one. Now, I don't know about you, and there are probably different shades of opinion across a small audience like this one, but I think there's a fundamental difference between thinking of the U.S. as a British-derived place that tolerated others versus thinking of it as a result of contending cultures, multiple empires shifting and pushing against each other over the course of centuries, creating a civilization that is not British, is not French, is not Spanish, but contains DNA from all three, along with indigenous influences. In my book, I contend Latinos are in the same moment the newest and oldest kids on the block. Juan Ponce de Leon was tramping around Florida in the 16th century and made it part of the Spanish Empire for centuries to come, today, Spanish-speaking newcomers are inheriting and revitalizing Florida's 21st century culture, and many Floridians are ambivalent, to say the least, about those changes. My book was the companion volume to a 6-hour PBS series of the same name, Latino Americans. It showed in the fall and continues to show on PBS stations across the country. Thomas Savage, the historian to whom Apolinaria is telling her life story, was there in part to chronicle the life of a civilization that he felt was antique and on the verge of, just being lost to history. He was having Apolinaria Lorenzana dictate her memoirs because he was convinced that as the United States took hold of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, that the Spanish traces, the Spanish history in these places would eventually be completely erased and replaced by the civilization of the burgeoning United States heading west in manifest destiny. In more than 235 years since the Declaration of Independence, an essential truth has often been overlooked by the generations who watch anxiously as new immigrants arrive by air, sea, and land. The United States has constantly been transformed by immigrants, and it has transformed them in return. And immigration anxiety is fueled when too much attention is paid to the first part and not enough to the second, that it is a two-way relationship. Talk to anyone who's come to live in the U.S. from anywhere else in the world. They become, with each successive year they are in this country, less and less a part of the place they came from and more American. And yet, look at the overheated reaction to the Coke commercial that featured in Sunday's Super Bowl. I don't know how many of you watched on Sunday, but it featured the singing of America the Beautiful, beginning in English and then segueing into a variety of languages. It scares, disturbs, angers many of our fellow citizens. Now, I take second place to no one in my affection for America the Beautiful, especially the verse, "O beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam, undimmed by human tears." It's great stuff. It's a prayer, really, because it's all written in a kind of future conditional tense, that this may become so. After all, when it was written in the last years of the 19th century and then revised in the first years of the 20th, American cities were anything but alabaster and far from undimmed by human tears. But back to today. The situation in schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, on TV, in the armed forces, in church, in all the places that make the country what it is, change is underway. At some point in the 2040s, a slim majority of Americans will trace their ancestry to people who arrived in the country from someplace other than Europe. For the first time in centuries, people who descended from the European empires that captured the continent, and people who descended from the generations of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Tsarist Russia, and places large and small between Dublin and Moscow, will be a minority of Americans. And yeah, it's a big deal for people in the old and new majorities alike. The oldest continuously settled city in America, as Professor Ruiz mentioned, is not Boston or Jamestown or Philadelphia. It's St. Augustine, Florida, San Agustin. From 1565 to 1821, it was a Spanish-speaking city. As European empires fought their wars in the New World, the Florida city lived under different flags from time to time, but it was essentially a Spanish place for 3 centuries. So the next time a tense local controversy breaks out in Florida over the use of Spanish, and it will, Just take a second to recall how much longer Spanish has been at home in that state than that relative newcomer, Ingles. What's now the territory of the 50 states, as we saw in the map, was settled by people from the Spanish Empire long before adventurers looking to make their fortunes colonized Virginia, long before persecuted religious radicals crossed the Atlantic and landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, long before the Dutch put a part of their global trading network in what became New York, and before French priests and fur trappers spread out through the headwaters of the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. This nation has been multicultural from the very first years after European mapmakers, mathematicians, and mariners jumped on ships and sailed west to get east. We've come a long way since those European empires stole and bought people from coastal West Africa and brought them here in chains to work, since priests asked popes to decide if Africans and Native Americans even had souls in the first place, then whether they were worthy of religious conversion, whether they had to be treated as human beings, whether they could be enslaved if they were converted. I bring this up just to bring a little reality to the conversation. This is not a guilt trip on anybody. History isn't good. History isn't bad. History just is. And it sets the table for who and where we are today. There's an America on the way that's going to take us all to someplace new, even as we remain deeply rooted in the history that made us. I don't know how many of you recall seeing an ad for Dodge trucks throughout much of last year, but beginning with last year's Super Bowl, there was an ad for the Ram 150 called God Made a Farmer. And it ran for the first time on Super Bowl XLVII, for those of you keeping track of it in Roman numerals, as the NFL seems to want us to do. It was a beautifully photographed set of heroic images of decent, hard-working farm folk. And as I watched it, I wondered if the people who took these pictures had spent much time on American farms lately to see who actually does all the work there, especially at harvest time. Not that long ago, I was in Sioux County, up in the northwest corner of Iowa. And everywhere you looked were businesses and farms owned by the descendants of Dutch immigrants. It's one of the most Dutch places in America. But more and more of the work in the restaurants, in the fields, driving trucks, at the grain elevator, was being done by Latinos. At a popular breakfast place, I sat at a Formica table full of farmers, except for me, and asked them if their own kids were sticking around, and if they weren't, whether they could see any of the Mexicans who now were responsible for a lot of the daily work and the productivity of their farms could eventually own them. They all hesitated for a moment and looked at each other and then said no. They couldn't really see it ever happening because the Mexican men, however hard-working, could never pull together the kinds of money it would take to acquire ever more expensive farmland, ever more expensive farm equipment, barns, seed, and fertilizer. The men in the diner were aging, still working, and most of their own children didn't want to stay on the land. So where does it all lead? When Tom Vilsack, now the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, was the governor of Iowa, he got a lot of pushback when he talked about the idea that the state, still one of the whitest places in America, was going to have to change. He suggested the state put out the welcome mat for immigrants, as most of them were going other places in the country. Quote, "The point is we need more people," Governor Vilsack said. Part of that can be done by trying to keep the young people here. Part of it can be done by trying to bring Iowans back to the state. But an aspect of it has to be a program or a plan or some kind of method by which we become a welcoming state for people of different cultures. Well, Iowans didn't want to hear it. As we embark on what's likely to be a nasty family argument over the coming years, about immigration law, who's welcome, who's going to come, who's going to stay, and under what terms, take a look at the places where the sentiment is the most negative. Take a look at where the most outspoken members of Congress come from. It should all be very interesting. Iowa is the home to the congressman who suggested that of the Dreamers, children who were brought here to live illegally by their parents, who also were immigrating illegally, far more of them were drug mules than valedictorians. The rewrite of the immigration laws in 1965 brought stunning changes to America. A third of the doctors at work in the rural South today were born in India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. For a region of the country that never really had an Ellis Island era, that was basically native-born white and native-born black, with the exception largely of Louisiana, the South has had to do a lot of adjusting. A few weeks ago, I was in Jackson, Mississippi, the state capital, passed by the Roman Catholic Cathedral right near the governor's mansion, and there was the Mass schedule for Sunday out on the front lawn, and what do you know? In Jackson, Mississippi, misas en español a las dos. Asians and Latinos don't fit neatly into the Old South's black and white binary idea of race, so stay tuned. As economic opportunity remains largely, unfortunately, a Sunbelt phenomenon, there's going to be more interest among immigrants in going to the states of the old Confederacy, and old thinking about race is going to be under the much heavier pressure that comes from the need to make a buck. Dalton, Georgia is the capital of the North American carpet industry. 40% of the residents of Dalton, Georgia are now Mexican and Central American and provide the majority of the workforce for the carpet industry. The social map of the United States is being redrawn in our time. One thing in common across minority groups and among newcomers are their relative youth compared to other Americans, which means that we're still very much on the front end of these changes as they make their impact in different sectors of society one by one. You see it in the maternity wards first, of course. 2010 was the first year more babies were born in the United States who trace their ancestry to Africa, Asia, and Latin America than Europe. First time that's happened in centuries, but it's likely to be the case every year from now on for the foreseeable future. When you look at America's Latino population, the largest single-age cohort, if you map it out by bands of the overall population that exist in different age groups, more than 5.5 million, that's the largest single-age cohort out of the roughly 53 million Latinos in the country, 5.5 million people, that is more people than the entire populations of Montana, Idaho, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and New Mexico combined, is under 5 years old. Those little kids are breaking like a wave on school systems in Florida, Texas, Arizona, California, New York, Illinois, and now not only those old familiar places, but in Arkansas and North Carolina and Georgia and Virginia. So immigration is not just a challenge to be endured and accommodated and adjusted to the way it historically has been on the coasts and the borders. It's everywhere. It's soaking into the American pores now. And I think the ferocious and sometimes panicky tone the debate is now taking on is a sign of that reality's deeper penetration into the American whole. Is this new or renewed Latin presence a social cost or a social strength? Remember, as we saw just moments ago, the Spanish Empire started the colonization and economic exploitation of a new hemisphere, earlier and more aggressively than Britain did, and it created a massive new thing in the New World, a Spanish-speaking zone that ran from Vancouver Island in the northwest of the Americas all the way down to what is now Argentina. Those territories included what is now the American Midwest in the days when Louisiana was Spanish, down through what is now Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Texas, all the way across to Florida, all Spanish, much of it eventually Mexico, and now part of the United States. So don't be surprised when you hear some Latinos say, like former Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar, whose family has been in his home state for centuries, "We didn't come to America, America came to us." One day in 1917, my grandparents were sitting and minding their own business in a poor and agricultural northwest corner of Puerto Rico, born a few years earlier after the U.S. seizure of the island in the war with Spain, and now ambiguous persons of unclear citizenship. And with the wave of a pen, the Jones-Shafroth Act was signed and made them, and of course their descendants, American citizens. What's different about these people? Well, for one thing, it's the first large migration since the Ellis Island era, but it's the first large migration that is also multiracial. Latinos are European, Indian, African, sometimes all three, or 2 out of 3. They speak Spanish with a wide variety of accents, or not at all. They're rural and urban, from deserts and jungles, mountains and grasslands. This is a fascinating time to be writing urban history, social science, ethnography, watching the interaction between immigration and the economy, immigration and the workforce, especially when you try to assess the impact of this new Latino presence in the United States. They come from 24 countries. The push and pull factors vary. They've certainly varied a lot over the last 20 years, from Cold War-based turmoil and consequent economic calamity to political repression to pure opportunity search and nothing more. New populations, certainly Central Americans, the largest feeder group in the Washington, D.C. area, and now in Miami as well, have had a roller coaster ride as different U.S. presidential administrations and shifting political stands have given Hondurans, Salvadorans, Nicaraguans a constantly changing set of legal hurdles, a constantly changing reception to asylum claims, given whatever that day's U.S. relationship was with the government back in their home country. So these new populations are bringing striking change to the country at large, but also to places like Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Lumberton, North Carolina, Huntsville, Alabama, the Yakima Valley of Washington State, Kalamazoo, Michigan. At the same time, the immigrants and the sons and daughters of previous immigrant flows are disproportionately making their lives in large metropolitan areas. So along with this very rural flavor to this new migration, if you look at the top 10 places of Latino settlement in the United States, they are, no surprise, LA, New York, Miami, Houston, Riverside, San Bernardino, Dallas, Fort Worth, Phoenix, San Antonio, and San Diego. I think most of you could have come up with that list. We could have crowdsourced that list in this room. And if you take just the Latino population in those 10 metros, you've accounted for more than half of the Latino population of the entire United States. So at the same moment, America's 2014 Latino experience includes country boys waiting to be hired for a day's landscaping work on a street corner in Brooklyn, and urbane professionals in $2,500 suits sharing jokes in 2 or 3 languages in a bank headquarters on Brickell Avenue in Miami. Unlike Germans, unlike Italians, unlike Norwegians, Scots-Irish, or any of the big immigrant groups of the 19th and early 20th century, the Latino presence in the United States is constantly assimilating and constantly renewing at the same time. Unlike those previous immigrant flows, which had a run-up, a big spike, and then a subsidence down to almost nothing, you've got constant renewal from different places in the hemisphere coming to the United States. Social service agencies in places like Washington and the Bronx and Chicago and South Texas are often led by the children and grandchildren of earlier immigrant flows and serve new immigrant populations. States like Colorado, Florida, Texas, California, New York are home at the very same moment to large, suburbanizing, increasingly English-dominant and white-collar Latino populations, and large, poor, low-skilled, non-English-speaking populations. They exist side by side, and politicians and political strategists are dying to figure out how to craft appeals to Latino voters that speak to all of them at the same time, and they're finding out after spilling a lot of ink and spending a lot of money that it's not that easy. How do you make political common cause between a rural Dominican newly settled in the South Bronx and a Puerto Rican supervisor in a municipal hospital who lives in White Plains in Westchester County just a few miles away, or lives in Western Connecticut? Is there a natural solidarity between a family that pronounces its name Martinez, lives in South Chicago, and came to the United States at the beginning of World War I, fleeing the Mexican Revolution, and the Martinez family that just moved to the Pilsen neighborhood, again just a few miles away, the port of entry barrio in Chicago, coming to the United States to escape small-town poverty in Durango? While Anglo-America, looking from the outside, might consider two Cubans named Ruiz very similar, one whose family came to Ybor City in Tampa 130 years ago might consider himself a very different kind of American from that other Ruiz guy who just got to Miami from Cuba after slipping away from a baseball game or a cultural delegation in Caracas and seeking asylum. Will the same issues affect or appeal to those very different Americans? Do we presume too much when we presume that there's something that holds them together, that makes them part of the same extended family? If you think answering those questions is hard today, in 2014, in 20 years, in 2034, it'll be even harder with decades more assimilation, intermarriage, and suburbanization. So there's some interesting things at play. I'll just close by pointing out that when I was in Europe last year, I was struck by the gloominess there about the future. And it's very easy to spot. And it has some of the same features there as our economic problems here. Extremely high youth unemployment, long-term unemployment very high, social welfare systems stretched to the limit. The difference is that there is a deposit of optimism among Americans, but particularly among Latinos, that is really striking given the circumstances. Latinos have been telling public opinion researchers for years now about how optimistic they are, about their belief in the future here in the United States. And yet, writ large, they've lost 2/3 of their entire portfolio, lost 2/3 of the entire accumulated wealth of those 50-plus million people between roughly 2007 and 2012. It's a shocking statistic, terrifying, stunning. The big metropolitan areas where the real estate crisis has been most acute, Las Vegas, Florida, Phoenix, Southern California, are also some of the metropolitan areas where Latino home buyers were heavily concentrated. Those aspiring families accumulating their modest pile of savings, while the big voices in the culture were saying, oh, better buy now, it'll be even more expensive next year. It's not a bubble, gotta jump on the train before it pulls out of the station without you. They were the last buyers into that overheated market, and when everything came crashing down, they lost more heavily than any other group of Americans. They squeezed through the front door of their new homes, and in a matter of a few years watched as their savings were vaporized, and now they struggle to come up with the monthly payment to service the debt on a house that isn't even worth what they paid for it, or in their tens of thousands, they've already lost those homes. There is a little bit more time to bounce back since the median age, both as home buyers and as parents, as workers, is younger than Americans as a whole, but still a lot of those losses will never be made up. But in the face of all that, that optimism remains, and that's something that America writ large can really be thankful for. As you look down the road to the viability of the American economy in coming decades, as minority consumers make up a growing percentage of all customers, we have to be thinking about what kind of socioeconomic profile these people will have in 10, 20, 30 years. If black and brown students of tomorrow continue to post college graduation numbers like the ones that have prevailed over the last several decades, this is simply going to be a poorer country than it is today. I pray that I can stop working full-time at some point in the 2020s and start collecting my promised Social Security, and my check is going to be drawn from the FICA taxes of a very different American workforce from the one that's paying in today. If those workers of the future are prosperous, my check is safe, and so are many of yours. If they lag behind, especially with the smaller number of workers for every retiree, that security in old age for all of us will be less secure. Whether minority Americans make it, at long last, won't just be of interest to minorities themselves, but it will finally be amply illustrated that we really are all in this together. All Americans have a direct interest in the high school completion rates, number of associate's degrees, and four-year college diplomas of black and brown Americans, because demographic realities will dictate how well in 2040 we pave the roads, maintain the communications networks, maintain the airports, how well we fund the schools that will keep future prosperity growing. In 2030, this will be a country with a much browner active workforce and a largely white and enormous population of elderly. Every place in the world that sends us legal immigrants also sends us illegal immigrants. And more than half of the 11 million that we're talking about right now and debating about what we're going to do, they come from just one country, Mexico. And I should mention briefly Puerto Ricans because the numbers on immigration don't include them, but there they are, and they're millions. And right now, there's a big exodus from the island, heading to New York, Chicago, Western Connecticut, Northern New Jersey, the places they've been going over the last 50 years, but especially now to Orlando, to Miami-Dade, to Atlanta and Southern California. This time around, it's not an exodus of farmers leaving the land to end up in tenements, but physicians, accountants, architects, white-collar professionals educated in Puerto Rico who are creating wealth and creating new lives on the mainland. Keep in mind that Puerto Rico was an afterthought, the unanticipated war prize for America in its war against Spain, a war that was largely not about Puerto Rico at all, but about Cuba. The earliest bills and court cases involving Puerto Rico had not to do with the people themselves, who became, as I mentioned, people of ambiguous legal status once the Spanish left, but they were laws and bills and tariff schedules that had to do with stuff, exports, agricultural products. That was the concern. If you were a sack of coffee, the Congress was far more interested in your whereabouts than if you were a human being. So I'll close with a story I tell in my book of Isabel Gonzalez, who brought a landmark Supreme Court case in 1903. She was engaged. Her fiancé was living and working in Staten Island, New York. She took a boat from San Juan Harbor to New York Harbor because that was the easiest and fastest way to get to New York. And like many boats of the time, it made a circuit of the Caribbean, picking up and dropping off loads of various kinds of agricultural produce. And then once heavily laden with things that came from Venezuela and Jamaica and Cuba and Puerto Rico, headed to New York Bay. When it got there, two representatives of the United States government got on the deck, as they always did, one from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, one from the Customs Agency. So while the customs inspector took a look at the hold, the ship's crew got all the passengers up on the deck, and the immigration officer went and started his work. Asked Isabel Gonzalez where she was going. She said Staten Island. He said, well, why do you think you can just get off this boat and go to Staten Island? You're Puerto Rican. You're an immigrant. And she said, well, no, I'm not an immigrant. I got on this boat in a harbor with the American flag flying over the fortress at the mouth of the harbor, with an American customs officer taking the documents and the bills of lading from the ship. Puerto Rico is America, so I'm just going to get off and go to Staten Island and marry my fiancé. They made her go to Ellis Island like an immigrant. And because she was already pregnant some months, the public charge laws that were imposed on immigrants were imposed on her. Because nobody came to meet her, she was assumed to be on her way to becoming a public charge, an immigrant who was going to land in the United States, have a baby, and throw herself as a burden onto the social welfare system of the United States. As it happened, her husband knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, and finally the somebody was the resident commissioner, the non-voting member of Congress from Puerto Rico. And he saw a real opportunity. One of the few men to be admitted to the bars in Madrid, Washington, D.C., and San Juan, Ricardo de Getao saw an opportunity and asked her to become the plaintiff in a suit against the immigration inspector for New York Harbor. Even though she got off Ellis Island, married her fiancé, and had the first of many children, and thus the case was moot, she pursued it through the courts, and it became the landmark decision that established the right of Puerto Ricans to come to the mainland not as foreigners, but as people coming from another part of the United States. So today, before you close your eyes, if you do take stock of your day and wonder if you learned anything at all during the day, you can at least say, I learned about Isabel Gonzalez. I learned about the Supreme Court case in 1903. I now know something I didn't know. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope the books got here, and I hope that you avail yourself of the opportunity to take a look, and I guess there's some time for Q&A. Thanks a lot. I'll put on my glasses so I can actually see you. Nobody wants to be the icebreaker. Yes?
What's your take on the actual land acquisition process past any of these wars? Mexican-American War, Puerto Rico, where the American system and Americans take over some of the lands that used to belong to the formerly Mexican, formerly Puerto Rican people.
Well, you might look at the American Southwest and conclude that the Americans stole it fair and square from people who thought that they stole it fair and square. I'm not.
I'm actually talking about the land titles. So when actually there was proof of ownership, and then it was negated by courts. And
you know, if you look at the last 1,000 years and the shifts and movements of people over time from place to place, standing in the way of a marauding army holding up a land deed has never really been a great strategy for proving that you're going to be the eventual holder of the land. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed with Mexico sort of at the point of a bayonet, made certain assurances to the present Mexican population in the American Southwest that was about to become part of the United States. Some of them were observed, some of them weren't. Certainly the continued option to operate in the Spanish language or to take on English was not at all respected. In some places where the land was less desirable, the land grants that the Spanish had granted after they stole the land from the Indians were respected, but in a lot of places where the land was more desirable and more coveted by Americans moving west, they found a way to get out of it. Later in this episode of the documentary, we hear the story of Mariano Vallejo, who was one of the great Spanish landowners and then Mexican landowners of California, of 19th century California. And when Stephen Fremont and his band of wandering buccaneers arrives in California, Vallejo welcomes them, gives them dinner, gives them something to drink, thinks they're just passing through, and ends up in jail with them possessing his land. Not really done fair and square, but I'm sure if you talk to the tribes up and down the coast, they might have something to say about fair and square as well. But then there was a backlash, which we don't learn about in our history classes at all. I wouldn't say not very much. We don't learn about it at all. Whether we don't learn about Cheo Cortina or the Gorras Blancas, the white caps, who become marauding, night-riding Robin Hoods, burning down new fences that establish the realities of new land titles, try to push back against the dispossession of long-settled Spanish-speaking populations in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and to a degree in California. They become folk heroes. They become legends of song. There are corridos written about their exploits, but eventually they lose, because eventually the grip and the irresistible power and weight of Uncle Sam becomes too much, and a bunch of guys in white hoods going around burning barns at night was never going to do it. Also in this episode and in my book is the story of Juan Seguin, who was the last Mexican mayor of San Antonio, and he throws in his lot with the American settlers who come to Texas, not because he's so enamored of Stephen Austin and his partners coming west from mostly the southern United States, but because he has a beef with the central government in Mexico City. He's opposed to Santa Anna. He wants a more federal constitution that gives more sovereignty to the local regions rather than centralizing power in Mexico City. So with the white settlers who have been coming to Texas for decades, he goes to war against Mexico to win Texan independence, and eventually becomes a man without a country as his land is appropriated by the new kids in town. He ends up back in Mexico, where he's also mistrusted because he fought against the Mexican army at the Alamo and at the Battle of San Jacinto. And it's only in the 20th century that Juan Seguin's remains are brought back to Texas, to the place he considers his homeland, and now are buried in the town that bears his name, Seguin. So there are a million stories that illustrate this long cohabitation on this continent, the long cultural and economic cross-fertilization, the long, for instance, economic ties between the shoe factories of Lawrence and Haverhill, Massachusetts, and the Boston merchants who run fleets of ships to go to California, where the hides of the ranches of Mariano Vallejo and his fellow Californios end up in the shoe factories of Massachusetts to become shoes for workers on the factory floors of New York and Pittsburgh and Baltimore. It's really an amazing story, and one that I commend to you, both on television. It's available on DVD, and a lot of it is viewable just over the internet if you want to sit and watch your laptop for a while, or, of course, in the pages of my book. Yes?
Your talk was really wonderful, and we really enjoyed it. But there is a controversy in the Hispanic community, Latino Hispanic, about the word Latino. And there are those in the community, such as Argentines, Chilean Americans, Colombians, who would prefer to go back to Hispanic. Do you foresee a return to Hispanic American?
I know that controversy exists. Can I be honest?
Yes, please.
I find it totally boring. I just find it so beside the point because Latinos are not graduating from high school at the same rate as Hispanics aren't graduating from high school. And those fish to fry are so much more important than that stuff. Over time, I think it's going to sort itself out because there is a generational difference. More young people, if you just ask them, what do you prefer, say Latino, and the future belongs to them. Certainly my children would answer that way if you ask them.
But it also includes then French, Italians, and Brazilians and Portuguese, right?
Only if you want to be pedantic about it. I grew up with Italians, and none of them thought they were Latino. Not a one. They knew I was, which is why they were chasing me home from the train. But they had no confusion about the fact that we weren't the same thing, and they had no fear of being confused for being the same thing by anybody. Andrew Cuomo doesn't worry about whether anybody thinks he's Hispanic or Latino. So I think people make too much out of that. 40 years ago, the whole argument would have been academic because by overwhelming numbers, when you asked people, they responded that the most important signifier for them was national origin. So they would say, no, I don't use Hispanic or Latino, I'm Mexican, or I'm Cuban, or I'm Puerto Rican. So these things change over time. They will continue to change over time, and I don't think they're that important. Sorry. Yes.
One of the things that really amazes me, given the size of Latino population in the U.S., is that, you'll forgive this expression, but how relatively little clout they have relative to their size. And, I want to hear your take on A, why that is now, and B, when you think it's going to change.
I think there's a cultural and economic dimension to it. I am also struck by that lack of clout. I mean, 1 out of 6 is just a lot of people, whether it's a little country or a big country, and this is a huge country. And it's striking to me how little attention historically this population gets, how little their history is understood or invited into the main narrative of American history, which of course it is. So I guess the easiest observation is that it sucks to be poor. Another one, though, seriously, is that I'm struck even this late in the game. I grew up in New York. I don't know if you could tell. And Puerto Ricans have been living in New York City in very large numbers for a very long time. And most New Yorkers who aren't can't tell you anything about them. Their customs, their history, what they like, what they don't like, what they do, what they don't do, what they eat. None of it. We are strangers a century into our presence in New York City. And it's not that different in other places in the country where similar Latino populations are right there in your midst. Certainly, Mexican food is widely, bad Mexican food is widely eaten in the United States, or what proposes to be Mexican food is widely eaten in the United States. But really beyond that, the same people who are going for the half-price shots on Cinco de Mayo at their local watering hole couldn't tell you what Cinco de Mayo is or why it's noted as a holiday, or if you said the defeat of a French army, they'd say, really? there was a French army in Mexico. Like, it's just totally uncharted territory. It's not that you have to change people's ideas about it. They have no idea to begin with. I mean, there we are in New York, where Puerto Ricans have lived in large numbers for a century, and they couldn't tell you the first thing about the Spanish-American War, or the Jones-Shafroth Act, or Operation Bootstrap, or the formation of the Commonwealth after the Second World War, or Muñoz Marin, or Marine Tigers, or anything that are, and these things are second nature, cultural milestones to Puerto Ricans themselves, who have become totally accustomed to being strangers in the metropolitan area that has been their main North American home for a century. Recently, Mark Anthony sang the national anthem at Shea Stadium when the baseball All-Star game was there. And thousands of our fellow Americans took to social media, as it seems they, like moths to the flame, they can't help themselves. They have to pull out their smartphones and begin tweeting their ignorance to anyone who wants to read it. But people were saying, oh, come on, seriously? Couldn't you get an American to sing the national anthem? And thousands of tweets complaining about Mark Anthony singing the national anthem at Shea Stadium. Now, it also is, I think, a signifier of just how much famous people live in a bubble. He had no idea that this was happening. The day, like 2 days later, that game was at night, so the second day after that, he was at JFK flying to give a concert somewhere. Reporters caught up with him and first told him that this was even happening. He needed an explanation. And then he said, well, I was born in Spanish Harlem. And as far as I know, that's part of the United States. And he started to walk away, and then he turned back and he says, and for that matter, Puerto Rico is part of the United States too. And just the idea that in 2013, it solicits the ire of people. Now, this guy, he wasn't like the Coke commercial singing the Star-Spangled Banner in a foreign language. He's a guy who grew up in Manhattan singing the Star-Spangled Banner in Queens and having his presumption to do that questioned by other people who clearly think of themselves as more American or having a better claim to sing the song than he does. Also, interestingly, at the championships of the NBA last year, maybe you saw young Sebastián de la Cruz. San Antonio Spurs, I'm not a big basketball fan, but they tend to win their conference championship quite often and go to the NBA Finals. So once again, there they were in the NBA Finals. And to open the game in San Antonio, after all, young Sebastián walks out onto the court, resplendent in a fabulous mariachi outfit, beautiful silver buttons all up and down the legs, the tight-fitting vest, holding a sombrero, sings the Star-Spangled Banner in English, perfectly lovely, big hand, and again, hundreds of thousands of tweets and Facebook messages saying, why couldn't they get an American to sing the national anthem? And young Sebastián, when contacted later, also said, well, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means. Why couldn't they get an American to sing? I was born in San Antonio. So again and again and again and again, we remain strangers, 50+ million strangers inside a country of 312 million people. I want to believe that shows like this and my book are part of the beginning of the antidote. They certainly aren't sufficient in and of themselves, but a beginning of the proposition, the proposal to America that this is not a separate part of history. It's not the history of those people over there. It's all our history of how this country got to be the way that it is today. It's a shared history. They teach Latino history in high schools across the country, and if you go into the classroom, it's only the Latino kids from the school who are in there. There's no other kids who choose to take Latino history because the way it's presented as their history, not our history. And it is our history. It's our history from the very earliest days and continues through these encounters throughout the 19th century, through the development of the United States as a global superpower, the assumption of Spanish colonies, the first colonies that Americans ever took hold of and operated, and then a kind of colonial power that didn't involve actually planting your flag places, but united fruit, pioneering a kind of economic colonialism that made American capital the dominant capital in Central America and much of South America. I mean, Americans of all backgrounds should understand this story, and they should know it the way they know about the Mayflower Compact, and the way they know about the Gettysburg Address, and the way they know about the Four Freedoms speech and other sort of central ideas about this country's past. This is this country's past, not another country's past that we have to learn because there's all these people here now and they're whining, so you have to teach them their special classes. It's our history. And I think it's a big mistake that started largely in the 60s out of good intentions and out of really a well-placed desire to tell people who felt that they were not included in the broad narrative of American history that they did have a history. And that's when women's history and black history and Latin American history really start to establish themselves in a big way in the academy. And now, 50 years later, we're unfortunately reaping what was sowed then, because there are now whole separate departments of women's history instead of women's history just being history. And to the extent that I'm a historian and I have a degree in history, I've always found that a little bit problematic, but there it is, and I'm not going to change it by myself. So, thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. I do have a little bit of some bad news. We did speak to the bookstore, and the books couldn't make it to the talk. The books are on their way, and they're going to be in the bookstore sometime this week or next week. We're so sorry that we couldn't have the books available for you today. I don't know if...
It'll be just as much fun to read next
But we
week
do want you all to get the book. Can we hold
them and have another panel with Ray?
We can talk about that, I'm sure. Yeah, we can discuss. And if you're not in the library, your book is everywhere, being sold everywhere right now. Let's give another hand to Ray. Thank you so much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.